every story has a beginning. Some are born in light, in moments of divine promise. Others, however, begin in the shadows, born from moments of desperation and human frailty. The story of the Moabites is one such tale. To understand their journey, we must travel back in time, back to the smoldering ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the aftermath of that great destruction, a man named Lot and his 2 daughters found refuge in a mountain cave. They believed they were the last souls on earth, that the story of humanity had come to a fiery end, and that the future rested solely on their shoulders. In their isolation and despair, Lot's daughters made a fateful decision. Driven by a primal fear that their family line would perish forever, they devised a plan born of desperation. They gave their father wine, enough to cloud his judgment and erase his memory of the night. On 2 consecutive nights they lay with him, ensuring the continuation of their lineage. From the eldest daughter's union with her father, a son was born. She named him Moab, which means from my father. This name would forever carry the echo of its origin, a permanent reminder of the sorrow and shame from which this new nation would spring. This origin story is deeply significant. It stands in stark contrast to the birth of their cousins, the Israelites, whose beginnings were rooted in a sacred covenant between Abraham and God. The Israelites were a people of promise, their identity forged in faith and divine calling. The Moabites, on the other hand, began their story in a cave, their identity shaped by human fear and a desperate act to survive. This fundamental difference in their beginnings would set the stage for a long and often troubled relationship. A story of 2 peoples bound by blood yet separated by destiny, whose paths would cross in conflict and eventually, in an unexpected act of redemption. The legacy of this beginning clung to the Moabites like a shadow. It was a story whispered from one generation to the next, a foundational myth that defined who they were. They grew into a formidable nation, settling in the fertile lands east of the Dead Sea. They built cities, established a kingdom, and developed their own culture and gods, most notably Chemosh. Yet the story of their conception in that lonely cave remained a part of their identity. It was a tale of human survival against overwhelming odds, but also a story of sin, a starting point that would influence how they saw the world and, crucially, how the world saw them. Centuries passed. The Moabites established their kingdom, a stable and prosperous land. But then on the horizon a new power appeared. It was not an army with chariots and swords in the traditional sense, but an entire nation on the move. The Israelites, having escaped bondage in Egypt, had spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Now they stood at the borders of Moab, a vast multitude seeking passage to the promised land. Their numbers were immense, their presence overwhelming, and their God was a force that had drowned armies and toppled kings. For King Balak of Moab, this was a terrifying sight. Fear is a powerful motivator. It can cloud judgment and turn potential friends into perceived enemies. Balak did not see a weary people seeking safe passage. He saw a swarm of locusts ready to devour everything in its path. He looked upon the camps of Israel and his heart filled with dread. He consulted with his elders, saying, "This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." This fear was not just about land or resources, it was an existential dread. The stories of Israel's God had traveled far, tales of seas parting and plagues falling upon Egypt. Balak knew he could not defeat them with military might alone. Instead of offering hospitality, as their shared ancestry through Lot might have suggested, King Balak chose hostility. He sealed his borders and refused the Israelites' passage. This act of inhospitality was more than just a political decision, it was a deep and significant rejection. In the ancient world, hospitality to travelers was a sacred duty. To deny it was to declare enmity. By closing his land to his kinsmen, Balak deepened the chasm between their peoples. He allowed fear to dictate his actions, setting in motion a chain of events that would define the relationship between Moab and Israel for generations to come, a relationship built not on kinship, but on suspicion and conflict. This moment was a critical juncture in their shared history. It was a test of character for both nations. For Moab, it was a chance to show compassion and trust, to recognize the familial bond that existed, however distant. For Israel, it was another obstacle on their long journey, a test of their faith in God's provision. But fear won the day. Balak's decision was not just a refusal of passage, it was a statement of fear and a declaration of opposition. He believed that a supernatural power protected Israel, so he decided he needed a supernatural power of his own to fight back, leading him to seek out a man who was said to have the power to command curses. Convinced that a conventional army was no match for the God of Israel, King Balak turned to a more spiritual weapon. He sought out a man named Balaam, a famous diviner from the distant lands of Mesopotamia. Balaam was known throughout the region. It was said that whomever he blessed was blessed, and whomever he cursed was cursed. Balak sent messengers with a handsome fee, pleading with Balaam to come and pronounce a curse upon the Israelites. He believed that if he could just get the right words spoken from the right prophet, he could weaken Israel supernaturally, making them vulnerable to attack. It was a desperate plan, born from overwhelming fear. Balaam was a complex figure, a man who seemed to walk the line between genuine spiritual insight and personal greed. When Balak's messengers arrived, God came to Balaam in the night and told him plainly, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." Initially, Balaam obeyed, sending the messengers away, but King Balak was persistent. He sent a second, more prestigious delegation with promises of even greater riches and honor. The temptation was too great for Balaam. Though he knew God's will, he hoped he might be able to change it, and he told the messengers to wait while he inquired of the Lord once more. This time, God gave Balaam permission to go, but with a strict condition: only do what I tell you. And so, Balaam saddled his donkey and began the journey to Moab. But along the way, a strange and miraculous event occurred. An angel of the Lord, invisible to Balaam, stood in the road with a drawn sword to block his path. The donkey, however, could see the angel. 3 times the donkey turned aside to avoid the heavenly being, and 3 times, an angry and oblivious Balaam struck his faithful animal. After the 3rd strike, the Lord opened the donkey's mouth and it spoke, asking, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" In that moment, Balaam's eyes were opened, and he too saw the angel standing in his path. He fell on his face in terror, finally understanding the gravity of his mission. The angel rebuked him, making it clear that his journey was reckless, and that his donkey had saved his life. This extraordinary encounter served as a powerful reminder to Balaam. He was not in control. He was merely an instrument in a divine plan far greater than himself. He could proceed to Moab, but the words he spoke would not be his own. They would belong to the God of Israel, the very God he was being paid to curse. Upon his arrival in Moab, Balaam was greeted with great ceremony by King Balak. The desperate king immediately led the prophet to the high places of Baal, sacred sites that overlooked the sprawling encampment of the Israelites. From this vantage point, with pagan altars smoking with sacrifices, Balak expected Balaam to unleash a devastating curse. He had paid a fortune, brought the most famous diviner in the world to his kingdom, and set the perfect stage for Israel's supernatural downfall. Everything was in place. Balak waited, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear, ready to hear the words that would seal his enemy's doom. But when Balaam opened his mouth, the words that came forth were not the ones Balak had paid to hear. Instead of a curse, a powerful blessing flowed from the prophet's lips. He spoke of Israel's unique status, their vast numbers, and their blessed destiny. "How can I curse whom God has not cursed?" Balaam asked. "How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced?" King Balak was horrified and furious. "What have you done to me?" he cried. "I brought you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have blessed them altogether." He had invested all his hope in this spiritual attack, only to see it backfire completely. Undeterred, Balak decided the location must be wrong. Perhaps a different vantage point would yield a different result. He took Balaam to another high place, the field of Zophim on the top of Mount Pisgah. Once again, they built altars and offered sacrifices. And once again, Balak waited anxiously for the curse. But the result was the same. Balaam opened his mouth and spoke another oracle, this time even more powerful. He declared, "God is not a man that he should lie. I have received a command to bless. He is blessed, and I cannot revoke it." The king's frustration turned to panic. The very weapon he had chosen was now being used to strengthen his foe. A 3rd time Balak tried, taking Balaam to the top of Mount Peor. By now, his desperation was palpable, but the 3rd time was no different. Instead of a curse, Balaam delivered his most glorious prophecy yet, speaking of Israel's future king and their ultimate victory. He saw a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter rising out of Israel. The plan had failed spectacularly. Balaam, the hired prophet, had become a mouthpiece for the God of Israel, proving that no human scheme or supernatural plot could ever thwart a divine promise. Balak sent Balaam away in a rage, his hopes shattered, his treasure spent for nothing. Though his attempts to curse Israel had failed, Balaam was not finished. He could not curse the people directly, for God would not allow it. But he knew a different way to bring about their downfall. Before he departed, he gave King Balak one final piece of advice, a strategy far more insidious and destructive than any spoken curse. He advised the king that if he could not defeat the Israelites through supernatural means, he should corrupt them from within. The plan was simple and wicked: use the women of Moab to seduce the men of Israel and lure them into idolatry. It was a shift from spiritual warfare to moral sabotage. King Balak put this dark counsel into action. The Moabite women went down to the Israelite camp, which was stationed at Shittim near Baal Peor. They began to mingle with the Israelite men, inviting them to their feasts and celebrations. These were not innocent social gatherings, they were pagan rituals, feasts held in honor of their god, Baal of Peor. The seduction was twofold. It was a temptation of the flesh, but more importantly, it was a temptation of the spirit. The men of Israel, who had been commanded to remain separate and holy, began to engage in sexual immorality with the Moabite women. This moral compromise quickly led to spiritual betrayal. Having been lured in by the women, the Israelite men began to participate in their pagan sacrifices. They bowed down and worshipped the Baal of Peor, a direct violation of the first and most sacred commandment given to them by God. "You shall have no other gods before me." They turned their backs on the Lord who had rescued them from Egypt, parted the sea for them, and blessed them in the face of their enemies. In a moment of weakness and desire, they traded their unique covenant relationship for the fleeting pleasures offered by their Moabite neighbors. The plan was a horrifying success. What Balaam could not achieve with curses, he accomplished with corruption. The spiritual fortitude of Israel, which had been impenetrable to outside attack, crumbled from within. The very people whom God had declared blessed were now willingly entangling themselves in the most grievous sin of idolatry. This act of betrayal at Baal Peor would have devastating consequences. It provoked the holy anger of God and brought a swift and terrible judgment upon the entire camp, proving that the greatest threat to God's people often comes not from external enemies, but from internal compromise. The Lord's anger burned fiercely against Israel for their treachery at Baal Peor. The people who had witnessed his power and received his blessings had turned to worship a pagan idol. This was not a minor transgression, it was a profound act of spiritual adultery, a breaking of the sacred covenant that defined them as a nation. As a consequence, a deadly plague swept through the Israelite camp. The divine judgment was swift and merciless. Thousands began to die, and a dark cloud of sorrow and fear fell over the very people who had so recently been declared blessed. The celebration with the Moabites had turned into a funeral procession. Amidst the chaos and death, the sin continued brazenly. An Israelite man, a Simeonite prince named Zimri, brought a Midianite woman named Cosbi into his tent in full view of Moses and the entire congregation, who were weeping at the entrance of the tabernacle. It was an act of shocking defiance, a public display of rebellion in the face of God's judgment. It seemed as though the nation was spiraling into complete moral collapse, with no regard for God or the plague that was consuming them. The situation had reached a breaking point, a moment that required a decisive and zealous response to turn back the divine wrath. That response came from a man named Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron the high priest. When he saw this public act of defiance, he was filled with a holy zeal for the Lord's honor. He took a spear, went into the tent after the Israelite man, and drove the spear through both Zimri and the Midianite woman. This dramatic and violent act was a powerful statement against sin. It demonstrated that there were still some in Israel who were loyal to God and would not tolerate such open rebellion. This act of zealous righteousness appeased God's anger, and the plague was stopped, but not before 24,000 Israelites had perished. As a direct result of this entire episode, God issued a decree concerning the Moabites and their cousins, the Ammonites. Found in the book of Deuteronomy, the law stated, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation." This was a severe and lasting consequence, because they had not met Israel with bread and water, and because they had hired Balaam to curse them and scheme to corrupt them, they were to be perpetually excluded from the formal community of God's people. The door to fellowship was closed, seemingly forever, a lasting legacy of their fear and hostility. Many years passed. The era of wandering in the desert gave way to the conquest of Canaan, which in turn gave way to the turbulent time of the Judges. It was a dark period in Israel's history, a cycle of sin, oppression, and deliverance. During this time, a severe famine struck the land of Judah, the very heartland of Israel. The fields that should have been bountiful were barren, and the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey felt like a distant memory. The famine was so severe that it drove an Israelite family to make a difficult and ironic choice, to seek refuge in the one land that had once been their enemy. An Israelite man named Elimelech from the town of Bethlehem took his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and traveled to the country of Moab. They left the house of bread, Bethlehem, in search of food in the land of their ancestral foes. It was a journey born of desperation, a reversal of the ancient story. This time it was the Israelites who were the vulnerable wanderers, and it was Moab that offered the prospect of survival. They settled there, strangers in a strange land, hoping to wait out the famine and one day return home. But fate had a different plan for them. Life in Moab brought further tragedy for Naomi's family. Her husband Elimelech died, leaving her a widow in a foreign land. Her 2 sons, seeking to build new lives, married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other, a name that would echo through eternity, was Ruth. For about 10 years they lived together in Moab, but sorrow was not finished with Naomi. In a devastating blow, both of her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. Now Naomi was left utterly alone, a widow without a husband and without her 2 sons, accompanied only by her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. In her grief, Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people in Judah and that the famine was over. She decided it was time to go home. Her journey to Moab, which had begun as a search for life, had ended in death and emptiness. She prepared to return to Bethlehem with nothing but a broken heart. She urged her 2 daughters-in-law to return to their own mothers' homes, to go back to their people and their gods, releasing them from any obligation to her. It was a moment of profound loss and despair for Naomi, but it was also the quiet beginning of a story of unimaginable redemption. Faced with Naomi's urging to return to their own people, the 2 young widows had a choice to make. Orpah, after much weeping, kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and turned back toward her home in Moab, back to her family and the gods she had always known. It was a logical and understandable decision, but Ruth refused to leave. She clung to Naomi, her heart bound to the grieving woman who had become her family. Naomi tried again to persuade her, saying, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth's resolve was unshakable. In response, Ruth spoke some of the most beautiful and powerful words of covenant loyalty in all of human history. She looked at Naomi and declared, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." This was more than just a promise of personal loyalty, it was a profound declaration of faith and conversion. With these words, Ruth the Moabitess, a woman from a nation excluded from the assembly of God, renounced her past, her homeland, and her pagan gods. She was choosing to cast her lot entirely with Naomi and, more importantly, with Naomi's God. She was stepping out of the shadows of Moab's history and into the light of Israel's covenant. It was an act of radical faith, crossing a boundary that had been sealed by law and history. She was choosing a future of uncertainty in a foreign land with a destitute widow over a familiar past, all because of love and a newfound faith. This covenant of the heart effectively transcended the law written in Deuteronomy. While the law excluded Moabites based on national actions of the past, Ruth's personal declaration of faith allowed her to be grafted into the family of God. Her loyalty was not to a nation or a culture, but to a person and the God that person served. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said no more. Together the 2 women, one returning in bitterness and the other stepping forward in faith, made their way to Bethlehem. Their shared journey would become a testament to the idea that God looks not at our origins, but at the posture of our hearts. Upon their arrival in Bethlehem, Ruth's character and deep loyalty to Naomi did not go unnoticed. She went to work in the fields to provide for them both, and her reputation for kindness and hard work reached the ears of a wealthy and respected landowner named Boaz. As it happened, Boaz was a close relative of Naomi's late husband, which made him a kinsman redeemer, a person with the right and responsibility to rescue his family members from hardship. Boaz saw in Ruth not a despised foreigner, but a woman of noble character who had taken refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. He showed her extraordinary kindness and protection. The story of Ruth and Boaz is a beautiful picture of redemption. Guided by Naomi, Ruth appealed to Boaz to fulfill his role as kinsman redeemer by marrying her. Boaz, moved by her integrity and faith, willingly agreed. He publicly claimed his right, purchased Naomi's family land, and took Ruth as his wife. This act of redemption restored everything Naomi had lost. It gave her security, preserved her family line, and turned her bitterness into joy. For Ruth, the Moabite outcast, it gave her a new home, a new family, and a place of honor within the community of Israel. The story reaches its stunning climax with the birth of a son to Ruth and Boaz. They named him Obed. The women of Bethlehem celebrated with Naomi, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." This child, born to a Moabite woman, would become the grandfather of Israel's greatest king, David. The line that began in shame and was excluded by law was now central to the royal lineage. This is the ultimate reversal, the final chapter in the story of the Moabites. The journey that started in a cave of shame ends with a place in the most sacred lineage in history. When the Gospel of Matthew lists the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, among the names of patriarchs and kings is the name of Ruth the Moabitess. Her inclusion is a profound theological statement. It declares that God's plan of salvation is not limited by ethnicity, nationality, or past sins. It is a universal promise open to anyone from any background who turns to him with a faithful heart. The story of the Moabites becomes a story for all of us, a journey from shame to redemption, proving that with God no one is ever too far gone to be welcomed home.